Hello and welcome to the GFX Hub. I'm Andrew McPherson. Super quick, if you like what you see in this video, I invite you guys to like it or subscribe to the channel. It helps other people find this content as well. Okay, so with that out of the way, today we're going to learn about something called keyframe interpolation and really how easy it is. Interpolation is just a fancy word for interpreting data, or in this case, interpreting keyframes. So for example, let's look at these two circles here. These circles are set to move back and forth via 3 keyframes over the course of 2 seconds. However, as you'll notice, the speed and positioning by which they arrive is vastly different. That's interpolation at work. So why should you care? Because if you master interpolation, your After Effects projects will require fewer keyframes, will be easier to make changes to, more flexible, and you'll be in perfect control of your animations. That's why. Now, the first thing you need to know is that there are 2 forms of interpolation: temporal and spatial interpolation. So first off, temporal, to no one's surprise, deals with time. You play around with temporal interpolation and you'll affect the speed at which an object gets from one keyframe to the next. Spatial is the other form. Spatial interpolation affects where an object is in space, its positioning. Play around with spatial interpolation and your object will use more than just a simple line to get from one position to the next. So, quick and easy quiz. The 2 types of interpolation are temporal and spatial. Temporal interpolation affects time and speed, while spatial interpolation affects space and positioning. All right, it's important stuff, but let's dive into this. So, you have a simple animation here of a circle going back and forth using 3 keyframes. Nothing fancy about it, so let's make it fancier. I'm going to select the position value here, and that'll highlight all the keyframes that are down here. And if you right click on them and you come down here to Keyframe Assistant, you can choose Easy Ease. Now, I almost never do it this way. I almost always exclusively press F9. That will get you the same effect. But you'll notice that these keyframes have changed from their diamond shape to an hourglass shape. That's the universal symbol for keyframes having applied easy ease to them. So let's play this. All right, so you'll notice that the circle's speed changed. It eases out and into the next keyframe. We did that by changing the interpolation of all these keyframes. You remember the name of which type of interpolation that is? If an object's timing and speed are affected, then it's temporal interpolation. Easy Ease is simply applying a cookie cutter temporal interpolation to your keyframes, which often gives your animations a more natural, less rigid look. I use it often. But let's dive a little deeper because we can play around even more with temporal interpolation. So first off, make sure that all of your keyframes are selected. That is important. Then come up here and toggle on the graph editor, this little button right here. You'll probably see a screen that looks like this. Now, if you've not played around with the graph editor before, this is where you can do some really powerful things with your animations. Now, heads up, the graph editor has 2 parts, just like there are 2 parts to interpolation. The first one deals with temporal interpolation, which is called the speed graph, and the other one deals with spatial interpolation, which is the value graph. What we're looking at right now is the value graph, so this would affect spatial interpolation. We will come back to that later. Right now we want to play around with temporal interpolation, so we want to use the speed graph. So come down here to the little menu icon, and come up here and hit the Edit Speed Graph button. Now we're in business. This is the speed graph. Heads up, you can also get to that same menu by right-clicking on the graph editor workspace and selecting your graph that you want. All right, now don't let this scare you. It's easier than you think to read this. These graphs are just like those XY graphs that you used to do in school. Now, across the x-axis, like any Adobe program, is your place in time. Now, the y-axis is your speed, which is measured by pixels per second. So the taller these lines are in the graph editor, the faster your object is moving at that given point in time. So let's read this graph. Now at frame 0, our circle is at a dead stop. It's not moving. However, as time goes on, it picks up speed and it crescendos here at about 30 frames at 1200 pixels per second. And then it slows down over the course of another 30 frames It comes back down to 0 at the 1 second mark, and then it does the exact same thing again over the course of the next second. So if you play it, it looks exactly like this. Not too complicated, not too scary, right? All right, well, I'm going to change something up here. Now, for those of you who care, if you click on a keyframe while holding the Control or Command button, you will change it back to normal. Now, let's look at what that did in the graph editor. It's just a line now, meaning from one keyframe to the next, the circle moves at a solid 800 pixels per second. If you see this and you don't want to, you want those curves, select keyframes that you want to add easy ease to and press F9. So let's undo that. That'll take us back to here. All right, so what's neat about the graph editor is that you can change up this curve, aka we can change up his speed or the interpolation. In this case, we're about to change the circle's temporal interpolation. So I'm going to hold the Shift key, select all three keyframes here. Or if you want to, you can also do click and drag, have all of them, but I guarantee that I can get this one. All right, you'll notice that these little yellow handles popped up. Now, if you're unfamiliar with them, they're called Bezier handles. Bezier is a fancy word for a mathematical curve, which is what we're looking at here. Now, if you grab the little ball at the end of the handle, you can change up the curve. I'm going to put the influence at about 75%. All right, so let's read it this time. Again, our circle starts at a dead stop, but at about the 43 frame mark, it crescendos. And it crescendos at about a little over 1900 pixels per second. So it's a bit faster than last time, but then its speed quickly drops back to 0 by the next keyframe. Now notice we have not changed any keyframes at this point, just the interpolation. So let's watch this. It looks a touch different. Now I'm going to play with the graph editor again and finish this up. Just complete the back half of this. Put it again at about 75%, about the same as it was last time. Now, again, I haven't touched a keyframe, but now we're moving it at over 3,200 pixels per second at frame 30. So let's watch this. I love this. It's super snappy. And for a lot of animations I do for work, this really helps things come to life. Now, heads up, to get out of the graph editor, simply toggle off the graph editor button here. Should look familiar now. So you can see that we can do all kinds of stuff with temporal interpolation. Well, you can do something pretty similar with spatial interpolation. Now, sometimes it's already turned on. Other times, like in this case, we have to turn on spatial interpolation. Now, there's a few ways to do this, but I most often select all the keyframes that I want to change, which in this case is all of them. Right-click on this and come down to keyframe interpolation. I've also personally mapped this to F10. All right, fun little menu here. Notice temporal and spatial interpolation here. Now, as an aside, if we were to change temporal from Bezier to linear, we'll do something familiar. Notice all the keyframes, once I hit OK, have changed back to their diamond form. And if we were to toggle on the graph editor, notice that we have that familiar line here. And if we undo, you have the curves back again. That's the Bezier setting. So linear gives you that line. The Bezier setting will give you your Bezier curve. All right, so let's go back to here. Right click on this. Select keyframe interpolation. All right, so let's change up the spatial interpolation this time. Let's go from linear to Bezier this time. Press OK. All right, fun but subtle change here. Eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that a little tiny blue Bezier handle popped up in our composition window. There's two of them there right now, but they're stacked on each other. But watch what happens when I play with them. You get a curve. It's a Bezier curve, but this time we're affecting its position. Let's play and see what happened. Now, we didn't add any keyframes. We still have 3 of them, but we made the circle arc. Now let's finish that arc off on the other side here and hit play. Pretty cool, and I'm hoping that a lot of you are seeing the application of this. For example, if you were animating a bouncing ball, you wouldn't have that ball moving in a straight line. It arcs. And the easiest way to make that happen is spatial interpolation. So what does this look like on the graph editor? Now, if we toggle back You'll notice that we're still looking at the speed graph here. I'm going to pause this. Now we're going to change this up to the value graph. All right, so let's read this. Now time is still the same as it was last time on the x-axis, but the y-axis is now positional values. They will correspond with the same numbers that are over here and your position, your x and y. Now the two lines here are your positional values, are your two axes on your position. So the red line is your x-axis and the green line is your y. Universally across every program I have ever seen that touches this, x is red, y is green, and z is blue if you have it. Easiest way that I remember it is the little phrase XYZ RGB. XYZ RGB. Then according to this graph, our circle moves at a pretty fair distance across the x-axis and then back again using a smooth curve. And it looks like our circle moves up and down a little bit too. You can see here on the arc. Honestly, I don't use the numerical positional values all that much. I check this to see if there's a smooth curve or if there is no curve at all. And here's what I mean by that. In this comp, I have two keyframes that are exactly the same. Their numerical values here in the position are exactly the same, which means that this circle should not move. However, watch what happens when I play this thing. It moves and it doesn't make sense. And if you're like me when I was first starting off, I pulled out a lot of hair trying to figure out why objects that I needed to stay stationary were moving when they weren't supposed to. I was like, I'm telling you to stay here. Why you move? Well, if you've got the same question, the answer is that your spatial interpolation is not set the way that you want it. Now, we can simply change a setting, but I want to show you why we changed that setting. So I'm going to pause this. Let's select all of our keyframes here. We're going to come back to the graph editor. Now make sure you're using the value editor. But look, it's a curve. We don't want a curve. We want a line. So toggle off the graph editor. Make sure all your keyframes here are selected. Right click, keyframe interpolation. The answer, change spatial interpolation from Bezier or continuous Bezier, auto Bezier, one of those three, to linear. Remember, we want to align, not a Bezier curve. So press OK, and let's watch what happens. Nothing. Beautiful nothing. And if we toggle the graph editor on, make sure your keyframes are selected here, you have a beautiful little line. That's exactly what we want. Now, oftentimes you'll run into this little blip when After Effects' reach exceeds its grasp. Sometimes it will automatically set your spatial interpolation to continuous Bezier or auto Bezier, which can be helpful in some circumstances, but not all of them. So if your object is floating around and you need it to stay put, change the spatial interpolation, and that should solve your problem. Well, I really hope that this helps you guys out. If you dig into this and apply it, your stuff can really go from good to great. So thanks so much for watching through until the very end. If you like this, I invite you guys to like or subscribe to the channel. But until next time, you guys have a great day. Bye.